So I've developed the underpainting with burnt umber, and we're going to move to color.
I'm going to start by using these two grainer brushes. So yeah, they're the brushes with some long hairs and some short hairs. The brand that I use is the Princeton brand. And I'm just going to start with this sort of color lay-in. I'm using, to begin with, some base flesh color. It's not like a flesh color in the lights though, it's really more of a desaturated sort of note. So I'm going to add some white and some gray and some yellow ochre. And I'll just start by laying that in. I'm painting on this really nice panel actually for a change. So it's not actually canvas today, it's like panel, which gives a really smooth surface, which is going to be really nice for, for it to be able to really show the texture of the strokes, and so as I'm doing them, I'm kind of working across the form, and I'm just getting the color lay in the lights to begin with. Just kind of crisscrossing over edges, and I'm using thick paint, pretty thick paint. As I move into the legs, there's some more burnt sienna-ish notes in here, so I'm kind of shifting, getting the local color in the lights shifting as I go, and still just like focusing on just the color lay-in. So I'm not really like doing any detail yet. I'm just massing like the main colors in. The arm and the back is less saturated. This is kind of our area of exciting color. Let's put a little bit, it gets desaturated at the back here. Let's get a less saturated note by mixing some gray and some more white, so less burnt sienna. The burnt sienna is like a really rich, really vibrant, kind of orangey color. So just getting that in. The top of the head actually has some of that exciting burnt sienna kind of note as well. Even like using a bit of the base flesh color up there just to get it even more sort of saturated. Again, actually in the leg, the hind leg here, we've got a pretty saturated note. So I'll use the base flesh color and some burnt sienna in here. And I'm just doing kind of wiggling back and forth and letting it make little rough, little textured edges. Even in this initial stage, we'll go into it more, but I'm letting it sort of leave some roughness, even at the very initial stage of the color lay-in. So I haven't gone into the back yet, because actually the back has some real cools in it, so I'm actually holding off on that. I want to get the really strong sense of warms and cools that are occurring. I think that's really beautiful, and depending on whatever portrait you're painting, the cools may not occur in the same way that they'll be occurring in this, but you just want to kind of always analyze and see what the lighting effects on your photo reference are creating in terms of a warm and cool contrast. So the back hind leg starts to get a little bit more cool, but just a little bit. So I'll use the ultramarine blue. Just get that in. I'm just looking at the camera there. Oh, good. So you guys can see okay?
It's good.
Oh, good. Okay, sweet. Yeah, it's interesting to see.
Are you still painting those sticks, or the receding colors, the shadow colors thick?
So I'm actually not quite, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. I actually haven't gone into the shadows yet. So everything here, although I'm starting to segue into them back here, but everything so far is lights, and so I'm not using any medium. I'm painting it really thick. So I'm really slathering it on, gooping it on. And actually, as I move into the shadows, I'm going to start to paint them, especially these darkest ones, transparently, and I'll mix some medium into it.
Okay.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Yeah, so as I move into this area, these are actually like, I'll start to go into it. They're not they're not full on shadows. They're kind of halftone. The only shadows are the very darkest notes, but we get some cools rounding into the shadows over here. So I'm mixing some ultramarine blue in. And actually, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Not being having a lot of experience with oils, so you can start with one layer and then start adding medium on top of that layer.
Well, I'm actually I'm kind of thinking ahead where I'm sort of thinking I want the lights to be thick so I can just gob it on. But I actually haven't touched anything in the shadows, which are the ones that are going to be more transparent yet. So when I go in with the parts that have the medium in it, which are the more transparent shadow areas, they're sort of going to be treated a little bit separately, like in that way. Like, yeah. So I'm kind of, that's a really good question too. So since this is kind of halftone, I'm still actually sort of gooping it on. Yeah. And as I sort of lift off the brush as I'm doing it, I do airplane strokes. So I'm starting with the brush like firmly, I've wiggled it around. It's right in there with the paint. And as I lift off and pull, it sort of creates the texture of the stroke. So those are like called airplane strokes, and that's how I'm starting to suggest some of the texture of the fur. So I'm just going to kind of carry this note, this halftone note, right up to the shadow. But again, not quite going into the shadow. It's like I'm setting it up for the shadow. And then we'll go into the shadows with more transparency. And there's just a couple little pieces of light left for me to just get in there before I shift to shadow. This ear could be a bit more orange. There's, burnt sienna. I'm using burnt sienna as the orangey color. There's some really light, cool notes in his tail. Again, do you guys see like the type of stroke I'm doing with the fur? Like I'm lifting, I'm sort of, doing airplane strokes as I take the brush off so that it creates a sort of soft edge. And really thicken the lights. So now I'll just kind of wipe my brush off. I'll sort of rinse it off, kind of clean it up and get it ready for the shadows. Let's put this other brush down. Just cleaning it up. And now I'll go into the shadows, which will be more transparent. So I'm using, I think you can see down here, I've got this is my Gamblin solvent-free gel right here, which is like a little bit thicker. Actually, my brush isn't clean enough. Let's clean it a bit better. So it's, really nice, thick. And it might be a little too thick, so I like to cut it with a little bit of my walnut alkyd medium. But using a bit of this Gamblin solvent-free gel with the walnut alkyd medium is my favorite medium right now, because it makes it just the right texture. Like it's a little bit thick, but it's not too thick. So that's what I'm going to be using for the shadows. And then let's see here. So I'm going to shift to a smaller brush just initially to get the line of the shadows. I have a new color on my palette. This is Prussian Blue. It's a really beautiful, rich, very saturated greenish blue. So that's Prussian Blue. I just started using it like this week actually. And I'm going to mix a little burnt sienna into it. It's also a really transparent color. It's super beautiful. And very saturated. So we have to be like we don't have to, but we could consider being slightly careful with Prussian Blue. I'm cutting it with some burnt sienna. And I'm just going to run that down the edge of the shadow. And then with my other brush, I'll kind of pull it in. Actually, I'm going to use some ultramarine blue too. I need something that's like a little bit lighter Yeah, that's a bit better. Like not too, it was just a bit too dark actually. Because it's so transparent, when a color's like really dark, when a color's really transparent, it just gets darker and darker with each glaze. So because I had a underpainting already, it was just like a little bit dark, so. Yeah, and then I'm just sort of shifting into a transparent sort of burnt sienna to go into the shadows on the side of the head. Actually, I just need to adjust my photos here so I can see everything. There we go.
Kristy,
Yeah.
Kristy, not to
Yep.
be too much of a pain,
No.
but when you lean quite forward, your hair...
Oh, here, let's get my hair out of the way. Thank you for telling me. Yes. Good. Thank you. Yep, that's the type of stuff I can't, I don't notice, so tell me. Definitely
Of course
tell me. So now as I'm going into the belly here, I'm using some burnt sienna. And I'll mix a little bit of light stuff in, just again, because I don't want it to be too dark. But yeah, and I'm also mixing some medium in. And I'm kind of wiggling along it so the shape of the stroke is going perpendicular to the edge. So it's also sort of melding into the paint beside it in a sort of soft edged kind of way. I'm going to also introduce a bit of that Prussian blue color into places down here. And again, wherever possible, sort of trying to end with a certain finesse, sort of pulling and doing a little airplane stroke so that I'm just kind of setting it up. I might soften that in a bit with the kind of fur-like texture in as many places as possible. And I can always refine it later, but just sort of giving a lot of chances. Is my hair in the way yet? I can feel it. Okay. There. Yeah, and then right along the edge of the transition between the lights and the shadows, I'm introducing even a little bit more of a cool note, like a little bit of an ultramarine blue. And then let's start working along, more of these transitions where the light meets the shadow. Again, I'm introducing with a little wiggle, a little bit of an ultramarine blue right in there. There's a kind of a anatomy line of the muscle right here. And I'm just kind of introducing that in. Again, trying to end with a certain finesse that sort of shows the grain of the brush, which sort of looks like fur. Yeah, let's do a bit there too. And then I see a little burnt sienna in here. Let's, kind of pushing the warms and cools. And again, it won't necessarily always, did I hear something? I just want to check and see if anyone's trying to come in. Nope, okay, good. Again, the structure of the light maybe won't always be exactly like this, where there's cools on one side and warms on the other. So always just sort of take a moment at the beginning of a painting to analyze what the lights are doing for your painting setup. So kind of looking for how the warms and cools are interacting. Yeah. And so I'm kind of working sort of organically, we're segueing into, the form modeling, and I'm introducing senses of form in, again, with sort of hair-like strokes where I'm letting the texture of the brush show through. So instead of just putting things in kind of flat, I'm sort of putting it in such a way that the stroke of the texture of the brush still shows. There's some anatomy up in here. We're sort of seeing the bony structure. The light source is coming sort of from the center, but there is a sense that it rolls to the shadows as it rolls to the left, and also that it rolls into the shadows as it rolls down. As it's rolling to the left, it's rolling into the shadows in a cool way. So as I've shifted to this smaller brush here, By the way, someone might be actually unmuted. I mean, I know I told you all to unmute, but maybe actually everyone should mute just because I do hear some background noise. But remember to just unmute and you can ask questions, like anytime you want to ask a question. So, yeah. So with the structure of the forms over here, just having them, that sounds better. Yeah, now I don't hear any background noise. I'm just having the forms round into the shadows. So they round and darken into a very small shadow pattern over on the left, and also a little bit of a pattern up here. There's some bony structure. Whenever you are painting animals, I would suggest doing like a quick Google search, or maybe getting the book Encyclopedia Anatomicae, which shows animal anatomy. So you can take a look at like the bony structure. Like, it's very related to human anatomy in a lot of ways, but you know, there are some differences. So it's nice to just like take a look at that so you can kind of understand. Like, this form here is actually the shoulder blade, and then we have a small bone that goes back, and then the longer bone here. So there's, yeah, it's just like nice to understand what is actually happening like in all these forms. Yeah, and this here is like another bony structure kind of showing through. And then actually on animals, they have their thumb up here. This is actually their thumb. It sort of sits up higher, like on their little paw. I've got some claws. Let's see, let's go a bit more into the head. So I still want to get, and I see we're running out of time here. This already gives kind of an idea of how to treat the like fur. But yeah, I think let's just give a little bit more sense of form with these like rounding strokes that suggest both form and fur texture. So I'm starting like along the edge and kind of lifting and pulling in to just create like a texture to the stroke, and also create that darkening note that suggests the texture of the fur. And there's again a little bony structure kind of right here. For the smaller stuff, I'm like shifting to this brush, but most of the time I'm using my grainer. It's really the brush that's like gonna give the furry texture, so I'm using that most of the time. But when I need to like really get into a smaller detail, I go for this brush. Like in the paws, it just needs to be like a little bit smaller. And you can still do actually like little airplane strokes with the other kind of brush. It just isn't quite as dramatic, but it still definitely works. Yeah, and we'll just do a little bit on the back leg here, and actually a little bit on the tail. So I actually haven't gotten the little shadow pattern in on the tail yet, and that's like a cool little shadow pattern. And again, like lifting and pulling as I do the strokes so that we can really see a lot of texture, just like keeping it loose, keeping it painterly, and keeping still focusing on the same things that we always focus on, like developing the sense of form and, you know, good structure, but also doing it in such a way that it's creating, textured brush work. All right, so now we'll go into a bit of the structure of the legs. I'm gonna sort of describe this tendon connection that I see being described in a sort of burnt sienna sort of note. So I'm just wiggling some burnt sienna in that area and getting that form turning a little bit more on the lower plane of his leg as it rounds down. Again, just with burnt sienna. So I'm really looking, you know, for the places where it rounds in a cool way and for the places where it rounds in a warm way. Let's build up a little bit more of the overall form of the leg, getting it to sort of darken as it rolls to the left just a little bit more with some little airplane stroke, kind of burnt sienna type notes. Just rounding that. And again, I'm doing it with little airplane strokes where I'm pulling the brush as I lift it off so that it leaves a trace of the texture of the grain of the brush, giving a suggestion of fur. And I sort of want, I don't want like every single line to be going in the same direction. I kind of want it to be a bit irregular in places. Yeah, there's just some texture to the fur in this area, and a little bit more texture as it rolls into the top coolest note as well. We just see like some of the kind of hairs of the fur a little bit more. And then there's another description of the muscle sort of showing right inside this area in a little bit more of a cool sort of way. So I'm just doing that with the slightest little touch of the brush and just letting it leave little hair-like notes. Just letting the very tip just barely graze the painting. And we'll get a bit more of the rounding to the left on the very edge. And yeah, and then I see a description of the muscle showing in the back leg. It's sort of like a tendon that then opens up to the muscle. So it's kind of like a line and then it opens up to the muscle, and below it I see a little bit more of a lighter note. And I'm just going to kind of soften. It's almost like cross-hatching the way I'm using the lines that are created by the hairs of the brush. Sort of just softening it with kind of like a cross-hatch in the direction of the fur grain. Yeah, and actually at the very top of this muscle here, we could soften this out a little bit. And again, I'm just using the texture of the brush in sort of a cross-hatching-ish sort of way to just take out some of the strongest notes that were there. Just soften it a bit. Let's work the very edge here. I think I would like to see just a little bit of a open form. Oops. Yeah, just like, and by open form, I mean sort of painterly, non-linear sort of edge. And we could get a little bit more dark in a cool note right in here. Yeah, and then I'm going to shift down to my smaller brush and just get into the feet. There's a little bit of a darker plane on the bottom edge of the foot, and it sort of rounds into that note. I see another little hint of a tendon right in here. With the drawing elements of this foot, I've let it gives a dynamic feel if there's like S curves. So this is like an S curve that's like, see, it starts here and then it curves up to here. So that gives dynamism when you have like S curves and C curves rather than angled lines in your very finished painting. So you might start with lines when you're initially like blocking it in, but then actually with this one I started with the S and C curves just because it is like so dynamic, and this is a really dynamic pose. Yeah, right on the very foot I see some lighter notes right at the front of it, kind of carving out the bony sort of aspect. And just working along certain edges like this one to just give a little bit more hints of the texture of the fur. You know, I kind of want this edge to end in like a fur-like sort of way. And a little bit more fur-like stuff down here.